Sarah Martinez had always been invisible, and she preferred it that way. At 32, she had perfected the art of blending into crowds, of being the unremarkable woman in apartment 7B of the aging complex on Maple Street. Her neighbors knew her as a quiet librarian who worked irregular hours, kept to herself, and always paid her rent on time. They had no idea that beneath her modest exterior lived one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the United States Air Force. The morning started like any other Tuesday. Sarah stepped out of her apartment wearing her usual disguise of oversized sweaters and wire-rimmed glasses that she didn't need. Mrs. Chun from 7A was watering her plants in the hallway, and they exchanged their typical polite nods. Sarah had learned long ago that the best way to maintain her cover was to be forgettable. It was a skill that had served her well in her dual life, where she spent half her time as an invisible civilian and the other half commanding respect in the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor. Her phone buzzed as she reached the lobby. The message was coded, but Sarah understood it immediately. Emergency deployment. Report to base within 2 hours. Her heart rate increased slightly, but her expression remained neutral as she walked to her beat-up Honda Civic. She had trained for this moment for years, knowing that one day her two worlds might collide in ways she couldn't control. The drive to Langley Air Force Base took 45 minutes, during which Sarah mentally switched from her civilian persona to her military identity. By the time she reached the security checkpoint, she had transformed completely. Gone was the meek librarian, replaced by Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez, one of the youngest pilots ever to achieve her rank and the holder of numerous classified commendations. Colonel Williams was waiting for her in the briefing room, his face grave. Around the table sat 5 other pilots, all men, all looking at her with a mixture of respect and slight bewilderment that she had grown accustomed to over her career. Despite her achievements, she was still often the only woman in the room, a fact that had stopped bothering her years ago. "Phoenix," Colonel Williams began, using her call sign. "We have a situation. Intelligence suggests that a high-value target is planning to move through restricted airspace in the next 48 hours. This is a joint operation with civilian agencies, and it requires our most skilled pilot." He paused, looking directly at her. "That's you." The mission briefing revealed the complexity of what they were facing. A suspected arms dealer with connections to international terrorist organizations was attempting to transport sensitive materials across the country using a private aircraft. The challenge was that he would be flying through heavily populated areas, making any direct confrontation extremely risky. They needed a pilot who could shadow the target aircraft without being detected, gather intelligence, and be ready to act if the situation escalated. What made this mission particularly challenging was that it would require Sarah to operate in both her civilian and military capacities. The target's route would take him directly over her neighborhood, and intelligence suggested he might be using civilian air traffic as cover. Her knowledge of the area as a local resident, combined with her piloting skills, made her uniquely qualified for the assignment. As the briefing concluded, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a challenging mission. But this time, there was an added layer of complexity. For the first time in her career, her carefully maintained cover story might be put to the test. The operation would require her to maintain her civilian identity while conducting military surveillance, a balancing act that could expose everything she had worked to keep hidden. Later that evening, Sarah returned to apartment 7B, but she wasn't alone. Hidden in her apartment were secure communication devices that would allow her to coordinate with the base while maintaining her civilian cover. She had spent years preparing for this scenario, creating a space that looked completely ordinary to any casual observer, but contained sophisticated military-grade equipment concealed within everyday objects. Her neighbor, Tom from 7C, knocked on her door around 8 o'clock. He was holding a package that had been delivered to his apartment by mistake. As Sarah thanked him and took the package, she noticed his lingering gaze, the way he seemed to be studying her apartment's interior over her shoulder. It was subtle, but her training had taught her to notice such things. Tom had lived next door for 6 months, always friendly but never intrusive. Now, for the first time, she wondered if his presence in the building was as coincidental as it seemed. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through mission protocols and contingency plans. In less than 36 hours, she would be airborne, tracking a dangerous criminal while trying to maintain the fiction that she was nothing more than a quiet librarian. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman everyone saw as harmless and unremarkable was about to undertake one of the most dangerous missions of her career. She thought about the path that had led her here, from a small town in Texas where she had first fallen in love with flying to the rigorous training that had transformed her into Phoenix. The call sign had been earned during a training exercise where she had managed to recover from what should have been a fatal spin, rising from near disaster like her mythical namesake. Now, she would need to embody that same ability to transform and adapt, to rise above the challenges that lay ahead. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Mrs. Chin mentioned that she had seen some unusual activity in the parking lot the night before, men in dark suits asking questions about the building's residents. Sarah's blood ran cold, but she maintained her calm exterior, expressing mild curiosity while internally calculating the implications. Either the target had somehow learned of her involvement, or there were other forces at play that she hadn't anticipated. As Sarah prepared for what might be her most challenging mission yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had built, both her cover identity and her military career, was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. The woman in 7B was about to discover that sometimes being invisible was the most dangerous thing of all. The morning of the operation arrived with deceptive calm. Sarah went through her usual routine of leaving for her supposed library job, but instead of driving to the municipal building, she took a circuitous route to a safe house 3 miles from Langley. There, she would switch vehicles and transform into Captain Martinez for what promised to be one of the most complex missions of her career. The intelligence update was sobering. Viktor Kozlov, the arms dealer they were tracking, had changed his flight plan twice in the last 12 hours. More concerning was the revelation that he wasn't working alone. Satellite imagery suggested that multiple aircraft might be involved in the operation, potentially using civilian air traffic as a screen for their activities. The mission had evolved from simple surveillance to something far more dangerous. Colonel Williams pulled Sarah aside before she suited up. "Phoenix, there's something else you need to know. The FBI has been tracking suspicious activity in your neighborhood for the past month. They believe Kozlov may have advanced intelligence about our operations." He paused, studying her reaction. "We don't think your cover is blown, but we can't be certain. Are you comfortable proceeding?" Sarah nodded without hesitation. She had spent too many years building her reputation to back down from a challenge now. But, privately, she wondered about Tom's strange behavior and the men Mrs. Chin had seen. The possibility that her carefully constructed civilian life was already compromised added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. 2 hours later, Sarah was airborne in her F-22, call sign Phoenix painted discreetly on the side. The aircraft was a technological marvel, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2 and equipped with stealth capabilities that made it nearly invisible to conventional radar. More importantly for this mission, it was equipped with advanced surveillance equipment that would allow her to track multiple targets simultaneously while remaining undetected. The first contact came sooner than expected. Kozlov's aircraft, a modified Learjet, appeared on her scope as it crossed into Virginia airspace. But Sarah's training immediately told her something was wrong. The flight pattern was too erratic, the altitude changes too frequent. Either Kozlov was an incompetent pilot, or this was a deliberate attempt to confuse any surveillance efforts. As she maintained her distance, Sarah noticed 2 other aircraft on similar flight paths. They were flying separately but seemed to be coordinating their movements in a way that suggested they were part of the same operation. The realization hit her like a cold shock. This wasn't just one arms dealer making a simple transport run. This was a sophisticated operation involving multiple players, and she was potentially outnumbered 3-1. Her radio crackled with updates from base command. Ground intelligence had identified unusual activity at 3 different airfields along the route. It appeared that Kozlov and his associates were planning to make multiple stops, possibly transferring cargo between aircraft to make tracking more difficult. Sarah's mission parameters expanded again. She would need to monitor all 3 aircraft while gathering intelligence about their ground operations. The first test of her skills came as Kozlov's aircraft approached the outskirts of her neighborhood. To maintain proper surveillance, Sarah needed to fly directly over the area where she had lived her civilian life for the past 3 years. As her F-22 passed over the apartment complex on Maple Street, she couldn't help but think about Mrs. Chun tending her plants, about Tom's suspicious glances, about the life she had built as the invisible woman in 7B. But her personal reflections were interrupted by an alarming development. One of the other aircraft had broken formation and was heading directly toward a civilian airport just 20 miles away. Sarah's instruments detected what appeared to be weapons signatures aboard the aircraft. This wasn't just about illegal arms dealing anymore. The situation had escalated to a potential terrorist threat against civilian targets. Sarah radioed for instructions and received immediate authorization to intercept. As she changed course to pursue the rogue aircraft, her training took over completely. Years of preparation had led to this moment, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between protecting innocent lives and allowing a catastrophic attack to succeed. The chase that followed tested every aspect of Sarah's piloting skills. The target aircraft was smaller and more maneuverable than her F-22, able to make sharp turns and altitude changes that forced her to push her own aircraft to its limits. But Sarah had advantages too: superior speed, advanced targeting systems, and years of combat training that had prepared her for exactly this type of high-stakes pursuit. As they flew over populated areas, Sarah faced an impossible choice. She had a clear shot at the enemy aircraft, but taking it would mean debris falling into residential neighborhoods. The rules of engagement required her to minimize civilian casualties, but every second she waited increased the risk that the target would reach its destination and carry out whatever attack it had planned. The solution came to her in a flash of tactical brilliance that would later be studied in military academies. Instead of shooting down the aircraft, Sarah used her F-22's superior speed and maneuverability to force the target into a specific flight path, herding it away from populated areas and toward an empty stretch of desert where an interception would pose no risk to civilians. The target pilot, realizing he was being outmaneuvered, made a desperate attempt to escape by diving toward the ground at dangerous speed. But Sarah had anticipated this move, positioning herself to cut off his escape route. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the two aircraft flew in a deadly dance, each pilot pushing their machine and their skills to the absolute limit. The end came suddenly. The target aircraft, attempting a maneuver beyond its capabilities, lost control and crashed in an empty field. Sarah circled the wreckage, confirming that the threat was neutralized while radioing for emergency response teams. But her mission wasn't over. She still had two other aircraft to track, and the main target, Kozlov himself, remained at large. As she climbed back to altitude to resume surveillance of the remaining aircraft, Sarah received an encrypted message that made her blood run cold. Intelligence assets on the ground had discovered that Kozlov knew exactly who she was. Somehow, the arms dealer had identified Captain Sarah Martinez and connected her to the woman living in apartment 7B. Her cover hadn't just been blown, it had been deliberately targeted. The implications hit her immediately. If Kozlov knew about her dual identity, then her apartment complex wasn't just her home, it was a potential target. Mrs. Chun, Tom, and all her other neighbors could be in immediate danger. For the first time in her military career, Sarah faced a conflict between her mission objectives and her personal life. She couldn't abandon the operation, but she also couldn't ignore the threat to innocent civilians who had unknowingly become part of her cover story. As these thoughts raced through her mind, Sarah spotted Kozlov's aircraft changing course again. This time, his new heading was unmistakable. He was flying directly toward the apartment complex on Maple Street, toward the home of the woman everyone knew as the quiet librarian in 7B. The hunter had become the hunted, and Sarah realized that her most dangerous battle was about to begin not in the skies above some remote location, but in the heart of the civilian world she had worked so hard to protect. The race back to Maple Street became the most desperate flight of Sarah's career. Every second counted as Kozlov's aircraft maintained its heading toward her apartment complex, while she pushed her F-22 beyond recommended limits to intercept him before he could reach populated areas. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now flying to protect the very place where she had hidden her true identity for 3 years. As she closed the distance, Sarah's radio erupted with communications from base command. Ground teams were being dispatched to evacuate the apartment complex, but they needed at least 20 minutes to reach the area and coordinate a safe evacuation. Kozlov's aircraft would arrive in 12 minutes. The math was simple and terrifying. Innocent people were about to be caught in the crossfire between a desperate arms dealer and the military pilot he had targeted for elimination. Sarah's mind raced through possible scenarios. A direct attack on Kozlov's aircraft over the residential area was impossible. The debris field would endanger everyone below. But allowing him to reach the apartment complex would put her neighbors in immediate danger. She needed a solution that would protect civilian lives while neutralizing the threat, and she needed it in the next 10 minutes. The answer came from an unexpected source. Tom from apartment 7C was calling her personal cell phone, the one connected to her Sarah Martinez civilian identity. Against all protocol, she answered while maintaining her pursuit of Kozlov's aircraft. Tom's voice was urgent but controlled, and what he told her changed everything about the mission. "Sarah, I know who you really are," Tom said without preamble. "I'm FBI agent Tom Morrison, and I've been assigned to your building for the past 6 months as part of a joint operation with the Air Force. We suspected Kozlov might eventually target military personnel, but we never expected him to identify you specifically." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her neighbor, the friendly man she had exchanged pleasantries with for months, was a federal agent assigned to watch her. But there was no time to process the implications of this discovery. Tom continued with information that immediately refocused her attention on the immediate crisis. "We've been evacuating residents under the cover of a gas leak emergency for the past hour. The building is almost empty, but Mrs. Chun refused to leave her apartment. She's elderly and doesn't trust authority figures. Sarah, she's still in there, and she's directly below your apartment where we believe Kozlov is planning to strike." Sarah's heart sank. Mrs. Chun, the sweet elderly woman who always smiled and offered homemade cookies, was in mortal danger because of Sarah's decision to live a double life. The woman who had unknowingly been her cover neighbor was now potentially going to die because of it. The weight of responsibility threatened to overwhelm her, but her training kicked in, transforming emotional turmoil into cold tactical analysis. With 8 minutes until Kozlov's arrival, Sarah made a decision that would be debated in military circles for years afterward. She abandoned standard engagement protocols and chose a course of action that put her own life at maximum risk while giving her the best chance to save Mrs. Chun and stop Kozlov simultaneously. Instead of intercepting Kozlov in the air, Sarah would allow him to reach the apartment complex and then engage him at close quarters. It was a desperate gambit that required perfect timing and exceptional skill, but it was the only way to ensure that any debris from a damaged aircraft would fall in controlled areas rather than randomly endangering civilians. Sarah landed her F-22 at a small airfield 15 miles from the complex, abandoning her aircraft and switching to a civilian vehicle that Tom had positioned there as part of the FBI operation. As she drove toward her apartment building at dangerous speeds, she maintained radio contact with both military command and Tom's FBI team, coordinating what amounted to a one-person assault on a heavily armed criminal organization. The scene at the apartment complex was controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles lined the street under the pretense of a gas leak, while FBI agents in civilian clothes guided the last few residents to safety. Sarah arrived to find Tom coordinating with local police, his friendly neighbor facade completely dropped to reveal the competent federal agent beneath. "Mrs. Chun is in her apartment," Tom reported. "She's barricaded herself in and won't open the door for anyone. Kozlov's aircraft is 2 minutes out, and we've identified at least 3 men aboard, all armed with military-grade weapons." Sarah looked up at the 7th floor of her building, where her own apartment sat next to Mrs. Chen's. For 3 years, she had lived there as a quiet librarian, building a relationship with the elderly woman based on mutual respect and kindness. Now, that relationship might be the key to saving both their lives. "I'm going up there," Sarah announced, stripping off her civilian clothes to reveal the military fatigues she had worn under her disguise. "Mrs. Chun knows me, trusts me. If anyone can convince her to leave, it's me." Tom started to protest. pointing out that Sarah would be walking directly into Kozlov's target zone. But she was already moving toward the building entrance. Her years of combat training took over as she climbed the stairs, her mind automatically calculating sight lines, escape routes, and defensive positions within the familiar hallways of her home. The sound of approaching aircraft engines filled the air as Sarah reached the 7th floor. Through the hallway windows, she could see Kozlov's aircraft circling the building, clearly identifying the target area. There was no time for subtlety or careful planning. Sarah pounded on Mrs. Chen's door with the urgency of someone facing imminent death. "Mrs. Chen, it's Sarah from 7B, she called out. "You need to come with me right now. There are bad people coming, and you're not safe here." The door opened to reveal Mrs. Chen's confused but trusting face. The elderly woman took one look at Sarah's military attire and the urgency in her eyes, and nodded without asking questions. "I wondered about you, dear," she said simply. "You always seemed like someone with secrets. Important secrets." As they moved toward the stairwell, the sound of the aircraft grew louder. Through the windows, Sarah could see men preparing to rappel from Kozlov's aircraft onto the building's roof. The assault was beginning, and she was trapped in her own building with an elderly civilian who moved slowly and carefully, unable to understand the deadly urgency of their situation. The first explosion shook the building as Kozlov's men began their assault on the roof. Smoke and debris filled the upper floors as Sarah half-carried Mrs. Chun down the stairs, counting floors and calculating how much time they had before the attackers reached the 7th floor. Behind them, she could hear the sound of doors being kicked in as armed men searched for apartment 7B and the woman they believed lived there. As they reached the 5th floor, Sarah's radio crackled with an update from Tom. "Phoenix, Kozlov has landed on the roof with 4 men. They're moving down through the building, and they've set charges to seal off the stairwells. You've got maybe 3 minutes to get out before the entire upper floor becomes a death trap." Mrs. Chin stumbled, her age and fear finally overwhelming her. Sarah faced an impossible choice: carry the elderly woman and risk both their lives by moving too slowly, or find another way out that might not exist. As the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from above, Sarah realized that the woman in 7B was about to face the greatest challenge of her career, armed with nothing but her training, her determination, and the trust of an elderly neighbor who had just discovered that her quiet friend was actually one of the most dangerous people alive. The explosion that sealed the 4th floor stairwell forced Sarah to make a decision that would define the rest of her life. With Mrs. Chin struggling to keep up and armed men closing in from above, she abandoned her original escape plan and instead led them into apartment 4A, using her lockpicking skills to gain entry in seconds. The apartment's layout was identical to her own on the 7th floor, which meant she knew exactly where to find what she needed. Mrs. Chin sank into a chair, breathing heavily, while Sarah moved with military precision through the stranger's apartment. She was looking for something specific. The building's original blueprints showed that apartments on the 4th floor had direct access to the building's old service elevator shaft, which had been sealed decades ago, but never removed. It was a desperate gambit, but potentially their only way out. In the kitchen, Sarah found the access panel she remembered from her study of the building's architecture when she had first moved in. Behind it lay a narrow shaft that dropped 4 stories to the basement. It was dangerous for someone Mrs. Chen's age, but staying in the building meant certain death when Kozlov's men found them. "Mrs. Chun," Sarah said, kneeling beside the elderly woman, "I need you to trust me completely. We're going to climb down through the building's old elevator shaft. It's going to be scary, but it's the only way we're going to survive this." The older woman looked into Sarah's eyes and saw something there that made her nod without hesitation. "I've lived 83 years, dear. If I'm going to die today, I'd rather it be while trusting someone I care about than hiding in fear." The descent through the shaft was a nightmare that tested every aspect of Sarah's physical training and Mrs. Chen's courage. Sarah went first, creating handholds and testing each step before allowing Mrs. Chen to follow. The elderly woman moved with surprising determination, driven by a will to survive that impressed even the combat-trained pilot. Above them, the sound of searching grew closer as Kozlov's men methodically cleared each apartment. They were halfway down when Sarah's radio crackled with Tom's voice. Phoenix, we've got a problem. Kozlov isn't just here for you. Intelligence just intercepted communications, indicating this is phase 1 of a larger operation. They're planning to use your building as a base for an attack on the naval facility 20 miles away. We've got multiple aircraft inbound. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't just about eliminating her, because she had discovered Kozlov's operation. The arms dealer was planning a major terrorist attack on American military infrastructure, and somehow her apartment building had become central to his plan. The woman in 7B had unknowingly been living at the heart of an international conspiracy. As they finally reached the basement, Sarah helped Mrs. Chun through the shaft's exit into the building's underground parking area. FBI agents immediately surrounded them, whisking Mrs. Chun away to safety while Tom briefed Sarah on the rapidly evolving situation above ground. Kozlov's men have turned the upper floors into a fortress, Tom explained as they moved toward the building's exit. But here's what we didn't know. They've been stockpiling weapons and equipment in empty apartments for months. Your neighbor identity gave them the perfect cover to scout the building and prepare it as a staging area for a larger operation. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. Her carefully constructed civilian life hadn't just been compromised, it had been deliberately used against her own country's security. The quiet librarian persona had unknowingly provided cover for the very criminals she had spent her military career fighting against. But there was no time for self-recrimination. Through the basement windows, Sarah could see additional aircraft circling the building, and Tom's radio was crackling with reports of suspicious activity at other locations throughout the city. Kozlov's operation was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had realized, and they were running out of time to stop it. "I need to get back in the air," Sarah told Tom as they reached the parking garage. "How long until my F-22 can be ready for takeoff?" Tom shook his head. 15 minutes minimum, and by then, Kozlov's reinforcements will be in position. But there's another option. He led her to an unmarked van where FBI technicians were setting up sophisticated communications equipment. "We've been tracking this operation for months, and we have assets in position. What we need now isn't another aircraft. We need someone who can coordinate a ground assault while maintaining air superiority awareness." The plan that Tom outlined was unlike anything Sarah had trained for, but it played to her unique combination of aerial combat experience and intimate knowledge of the building where she had lived her double life. She would coordinate a joint FBI military operation from a mobile command center while fighter aircraft from her squadron provided air support for a ground assault on the building. As Sarah put on a tactical headset and began coordinating with both ground teams and her fellow pilots, she experienced a strange sense of completion. For years, she had kept her two lives rigidly separated, never allowing Captain Martinez and the woman in 7B to intersect. Now, the success of the mission depended on integrating every aspect of her identity and experience. The assault began with precision strikes by F-22s that eliminated Kozlov's aircraft while they were still on the ground, preventing any escape attempt. Sarah directed the air strikes with intimate knowledge of the building's structure, ensuring that the attacks disabled the criminals' equipment without bringing down the building or endangering any remaining civilians in nearby structures. Simultaneously, FBI teams entered the building from multiple access points, guided by Sarah's detailed knowledge of the layout and Kozlov's likely defensive positions. Her years of casual observation as a resident, combined with her military tactical training, allowed her to predict enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. The final confrontation came when Kozlov himself, cornered in Sarah's own apartment 7B, made a desperate last stand. Through building security cameras, Sarah watched as the arms dealer barricaded himself in the space where she had lived her quiet civilian life for 3 years. The irony was profound. The most dangerous criminal she had ever faced was making his final stand in the place where she had pretended to be harmless and invisible. Tom led the FBI team that finally breached apartment 7B, finding Kozlov surrounded by evidence of his extensive operation. The apartment that Sarah had furnished as a believable librarian's home was revealed to contain sophisticated surveillance equipment that had been used to monitor military communications and plan the terrorist operation. As the dust settled and Kozlov was taken into custody, Sarah stood in the parking lot of her former home, watching as investigators cataloged evidence and emergency teams ensured the building was safe for residents to return. Mrs. Chen approached her, moving slowly but with dignity, and took Sarah's hands in her weathered ones. "I always knew you were special, dear," the elderly woman said. "I just didn't know how special. Thank you for saving my life." She paused, studying Sarah's face. "Will you be coming back to 7B?" Sarah looked up at the building where she had spent 3 years living a carefully constructed lie, where she had built genuine friendships based on a false identity, where she had found a kind of peace that balanced her high-stress military career. The apartment that had been her sanctuary was now a crime scene, and her cover identity was irreversibly blown. "No," Sarah replied softly. "The woman in 7B doesn't exist anymore. She was just a story I told for so long that I almost started to believe it myself." 3 weeks later, Captain Sarah Martinez received the Distinguished Flying Cross for her role in stopping what investigators later determined was one of the most sophisticated terrorist operations ever attempted against American military installations. The ceremony was attended by high-ranking officials who praised her innovative tactics and her ability to adapt to an unprecedented situation. But the commendation that meant the most to her came from Mrs. Chun, who sent a handwritten card to her new address. The card simply read, "To my dear friend Sarah, whoever you really are, thank you for showing me that heroes can look like anyone, even quiet librarians. Love, your neighbor in 7A." Sarah kept the card on her desk at Langley Air Force Base, a reminder that identity wasn't just about the roles people played or the uniforms they wore. It was about the connections they built with others and the courage they showed when everything they thought they knew about themselves was put to the ultimate test. The woman in 7B was gone, but Captain Sarah Martinez had learned something valuable from her, that the most effective disguise wasn't about becoming invisible, but about becoming genuinely human. And sometimes, the greatest victory wasn't in the sky, but in the simple act of keeping faith with the people who trusted you, even when they didn't know who you really were. Years later, when other pilots asked her about her most challenging mission, Sarah would tell them about the day she had to choose between her cover and her conscience, between her safety and her neighbors' lives. She would tell them that being Phoenix had made her a great pilot, but being the woman in 7B had made her a better person. And sometimes, she would add with a smile, that was the more important victory of all.